You don't belong here, old man. The words sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and cold. Ben Carter, an airman barely out of his 20s, stood with his hands firmly planted on his hips, eyes narrowed. His uniform was immaculate, a symbol of the pride he took in his duties. He had no time for anyone who wasn't authorized. And the frail, older man before him, wearing a faded jacket and a hat that had seen better days, looked out of place. Step aside, or I'll have to call security, Ben added, his voice dripping with condescension. Martin Walker, 85 years old and a man who had seen far more than his fair share of conflict, said nothing. His hands were steady on the wheels of his chair, his posture straight. His blue eyes, despite the years, still held a depth that could stop anyone in their tracks. He looked past Ben, across the runway where the military jets lined up, ready for a mission that Martin had once commanded. The airmen around him whispered, some chuckling under their breath. What's he doing here? Probably lost, one muttered. But Martin's silence only seemed to fuel their mockery. Ben waved a hand dismissively. I don't care who you are, you need to leave. Martin finally spoke, his voice gravelly but calm. I'm here to see the planes, he said, nodding towards the aircrafts. I know a few things about them. Ben sneered. You? Know about these? He gestured to the sleek fighters with a laugh. Old man, I think you've got the wrong idea. This is no place for someone like you. Ben's words stung, but Martin didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a tarnished medal. It hung loosely from a ribbon, faded with time, but undeniably real. The moment was too much for Ben to ignore, and he walked over, his boots tapping loudly on the concrete. He snatched the medal from Martin's hand. What's this supposed to be? A joke? He sneered, inspecting the small piece of metal. Martin didn't react. He simply stared at the airman in front of him. That medal, he said quietly, is worth more than any of your pride. As Ben examined the medal, something within him flickered, a flash of confusion, but it was gone before he could understand it. Then, just as the mockery was about to escalate, the sound of military vehicles pulling up in the distance stopped them all in their tracks. The airman looked up, confused. Martin's expression remained unchanged. A convoy of black military SUVs rolled in, their tires crunching on the tarmac as they stopped with precision. The doors opened with military efficiency. Out stepped Colonel Hayes, a sharp figure in his crisp uniform, his gaze locked on Martin. He took one look at the man, then at Ben. You're mistaken, Hayes said, his voice calm but commanding. This man is no ordinary veteran. Ben's confusion turned to disbelief as Hayes turned to the rest of the airmen. Stand at attention, he ordered. The airmen froze. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his expression hardening as he looked at Martin with a reverence that the others could not understand. Mr. Walker, Hayes said, his voice suddenly full of respect. It's an honor to have you here. The words seemed to resonate throughout the entire base. Every airman stood at attention, not because they had been ordered to, but because they could feel the weight of the man before them. Ben's eyes widened as realization hit him. The frail man he had dismissed so easily was a living legend, a man whose name was synonymous with heroism. He had just tried to humiliate a man who had saved lives, fought battles, and led the charge in ways Ben could never even fathom. I didn't know, Ben stammered. Martin gave him a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement, but said nothing more. Colonel Hayes turned to the waiting aircraft. Let's get him to the hangar, he said, as Martin wheeled himself forward, the airmen silently following, their eyes glued to the man who had once commanded them all. As the convoy made its way down the tarmac, Martin felt the familiar weight of the airfield pressing around him. The sound of the engines roaring in the background, the hum of military life. He'd been here before, so many years ago. But today it was different. Today they saw him. He could feel the eyes of the young airman on his back as he rolled toward the hangar, their earlier mockery replaced by uncertainty. Colonel Hayes walked beside him, his stride purposeful, his eyes focused ahead. But Martin noticed the slight shift in the airman's posture, a respect that had not been there moments before. The hangar. Doors loomed ahead, and Martin couldn't help but glance at the sleek aircrafts, their polished exteriors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had flown machines like these in his day, but today he was just an observer. As they approached the massive door, Martin's mind drifted back to the days of his service, to the years when the sky had been his domain. He could hear the roar of engines in the distance, the sharp crackle of radios, and the adrenaline that had surged through him as a young pilot. It felt like another lifetime, one full of fire and glory, and now it seemed so distant. "Martin," Colonel Hayes said, pulling him from his thoughts. "They need you." The hangar buzzed with activity as engineers and airmen scurried around, preparing the planes for their next mission. The noise was deafening, the clatter of tools and the sharp commands flying back and forth filling the air. But as soon as Martin entered the room, everything stopped. It was like the room itself had taken a collective breath, waiting for something to happen. The airmen stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Their commanding officer had just brought in a man who, by all accounts, should have been retired long ago. Yet here he was, standing before them. The tension in the air was thick. Ben Carter, the airman who had mocked him earlier, stood at the far end of the hangar, his gaze fixed on Martin. His jaw tightened as he realized that the old man who had been a nuisance just moments ago was now at the center of it all. "What do you need me to do?" Martin's voice broke through the silence. It was quiet, steady, but full of authority. Colonel Hayes gestured to the massive jet in front of them, an F-22 Raptor that had been having mechanical issues. "The plane's been down for hours," Hayes said. The team stumped. "We need a fresh set of eyes." Martin nodded slowly, his hands steady as he wheeled himself closer to the aircraft. The young engineers stared at him, some still skeptical, others simply curious. He could hear their whispered comments, the doubt hanging in the air. But Martin didn't mind. He had been underestimated his whole life. Slowly, he rolled up to the massive aircraft, the hum of the air conditioning and the low chatter of the engineers fading into the background. He reached out, running his fingers along the cold metal of the F-22, feeling its every curve and seam. He knew this aircraft. He had worked on similar planes during his service. The modern tech might have changed, but the heart of the machine, the engineering, the power, remained the same. "What's the issue?" Martin asked, looking directly at the lead engineer. The engineer, a young man named Kyle, seemed taken aback. He hesitated for a moment before answering, as if unsure whether to trust the old man. "It's the electrical systems," Kyle said, pointing to the fuselage. "We've run diagnostics, but nothing's coming up. The computer says everything is fine, but the plane won't start." Martin nodded again, his gaze shifting from the machine to the engineers, who were still watching him. "The computer doesn't know this plane," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He began to inspect the fuselage, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the systems. His hands moved with the surety of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The engineers watched, some skeptical, others fascinated. Martin's movements were slow, deliberate, but each step exuded a quiet confidence. "The issue's here," he said finally, pointing to a panel near the tail. "The sensor's been damaged. It's not reading correctly, and the system is interpreting it as a fault elsewhere." The airmen exchanged uncertain glances. Kyle stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "We've already checked that panel. It's fine," he said. "I can run the diagnostics again, but it's not the diagnostics you need," Martin interrupted. "You need experience. This machine has a soul. You've got to listen to it." For a moment, the room fell silent. The young engineers exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. But Martin didn't wait for their approval. He opened the panel, exposing the intricate wiring beneath, and began working his way through the problem. It took him minutes, but to the engineers, it felt like hours. Slowly, they began to realize that Martin was right. The solution wasn't in the computer. It was in his hands, in his years of experience, and in his quiet, unassuming confidence. When Martin finally finished, he looked up. "Try it now," he said. The lead engineer, Kyle, hesitated for a second before stepping forward and flipping the switch. The plane roared to life, its engines firing up with a deep, powerful hum. The airman stood there, stunned. Kyle's eyes widened. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Martin smiled slightly. "Experience," he said, pushing his chair back and rolling away from the plane. "It's something you can't find in a manual." The engineers stared at him, and one by one, they stepped forward to offer a quiet salute, their respect now unmistakable. Ben Carter, standing off to the side, looked on in awe. He had just witnessed something he couldn't explain, something that shattered everything he thought he knew about veterans. As Martin wheeled himself away, Ben felt a strange sensation, one of deep respect, mixed with a hint of regret. He had judged the old man far too quickly, and now he understood that the true power lay not in machines, but in the hands of those who had lived through the battles, who had been there when it mattered most. As the hangar fell silent, the hum of the aircraft engines now replaced by an eerie stillness, Martin felt the weight of the moment settle around him. The young airmen, who had once mocked him, now stood in awe. They couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Martin, the frail old man they had barely noticed, had just fixed a machine they couldn't, and they knew it. Ben Carter, still standing off to the side, watched as the engineers gathered around the aircraft, nodding in disbelief. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could this man, who seemed so ordinary at first glance, have such knowledge? How had he been able to identify the problem so quickly, so confidently, when their technology had failed? The question gnawed at him. As Martin rolled away from the aircraft, he paused, looking back at the young airman. "You all have the tools," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But there's more to this than gadgets and wires. Sometimes you have to listen to the machine, understand its language." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. The engineers knew exactly what he meant. He had spoken not just to them, but to their pride, their very sense of purpose. Martin's words hung in the air long after he had left the hangar. Ben, however, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than anyone had realized. The veteran had walked in, quietly, without fanfare, and had transformed the atmosphere in a way no one had expected. As the last of the engineers finished securing the F-22, Ben approached Colonel Hayes, who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal. "Sir," Ben said, his voice a mixture of confusion and admiration. "Who is he?" "Really?" Hayes turned to face him, his expression softening slightly. "You're asking about Martin Walker, aren't you?" Ben nodded, not sure if he was ready for the answer. Martin Walker was one of the best pilots this country has ever known. He saved more lives than you can count during his time in service. He didn't retire because he was too old, Ben. He retired because he knew when it was time to pass the torch. But the thing about legends like him is that they never really retire. They just wait for the right moment to step back in. Ben stood still, his mind reeling. The man he had dismissed so easily, the man he had tried to shoo off earlier, had been a living legend all along. "He's that good?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes nodded. "Better. He's forgotten more about flying, about saving lives, than most of us will ever know." The weight of Hayes's words hung in the air, pressing down on Ben's chest. He had learned an important lesson that day, one he wouldn't soon forget. As the hangar slowly came back to life, the engineers resuming their tasks, Ben found himself staring at the place where Martin had stood, the quiet, unassuming veteran who had just proven that some things couldn't be measured by technology alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Ben. He couldn't focus on the usual tasks, his mind drifting back to the veteran who had just walked in, fixed the plane, and walked out as if it were nothing. It wasn't until later, when Ben was alone, that the full realization hit him. Martin wasn't just some forgotten relic from the past. He was the embodiment of everything they strived to be: patient, experienced, calm under pressure, and above all, willing to teach when others were too proud to learn. The young airman's arrogance had been shattered, and in its place was a deep respect for the man who had given so much. Ben stood up, his resolve hardening. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about understanding the heart of what they did, and Martin Walker had shown him exactly that. The next day, Ben Carter found himself back at the hangar, still processing everything that had happened. It was early morning, and the hangar was relatively quiet, save for the sounds of machinery being prepared for the day's work. But today, something felt different. The airmen walked around with a new sense of purpose, their previous cockiness replaced by a quiet respect for the man who had shown them all what real experience looked like. As Ben walked through the hangar, he couldn't help but glance at the spot where Martin had fixed the F-22. It was a simple patch of concrete now, but to Ben, it felt like the most important part of the room. That was where everything had changed. As he walked toward his assigned plane for the day, he saw Colonel Hayes across the room, talking to a group of senior officers. Hayes caught his eye and gestured for Ben to join them. "Ben," Hayes said, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to understand something. Yesterday was a lesson. Not just for you, but for everyone here. What Martin did wasn't magic. It was experience. It was years of working with these machines, knowing them in ways that you and I can't even imagine. Ben nodded, unsure of what to say. Sir, I still don't fully get it. How did he know? Hayes smiled slightly, as if expecting the question. Because Martin has spent his life working with these machines. He doesn't need a fancy diagnostic tool to figure out what's wrong. He listens to the plane, feels it, understands it on a level we can't. That's something you won't find in a manual or a computer screen. That's something you earn through experience. Ben thought about that for a moment. But he's not even active duty anymore, sir. How does he still have that kind of power? Because he earned it, Hayes said simply. It's not about rank or titles, Ben. It's about what you've done, what you've been through. And Martin has been through it all. He's a living legend. The words hit Ben like a punch to the stomach. Living legend. He had spent most of his life assuming that those kinds of people were just stories, things you read about in history books or hear about in passing. But Martin Walker wasn't a story. He was standing right in front of him. I don't think I'll ever understand it fully, Ben said quietly. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never underestimate anyone again. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. That's the lesson, Ben. Always respect the people who came before you. And always be willing to learn. As the day went on, Ben found himself watching Martin more closely. The veteran was everywhere, helping out with small tasks, offering advice to airmen, and most of all, quietly commanding respect without ever raising his voice. It was a strange thing to witness. The man didn't seem like he belonged in this new world of cutting-edge technology and high-tech gadgets. Yet, in every way that mattered, he was exactly where he needed to be. By the end of the day, Ben found himself standing at the doorway of the hangar, watching Martin as he wheeled himself toward the exit. The old man didn't look back, but Ben could feel the weight of his experience in the air around him. The man had lived through more than anyone could imagine, and now, in his twilight years, he had become the standard by which the rest of them were measured. Ben knew he would never forget the lesson Martin had taught him. Not just about aircraft and mechanics, but about respect, humility, and the power of experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben stood in the quiet hangar, feeling a newfound sense of purpose settle within him. He had a long way to go before he could even begin to measure up to the men like Martin Walker, but that didn't scare him anymore. It motivated him. And that, he realized, was the true power of the legends that walked among them. The following week, Ben Carter found himself once again walking through the hangar, but today felt different. There was a newfound sense of respect in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the past. As the young airmen went about their tasks, there was no more mockery, no more condescension. They moved with purpose, their eyes steady, their postures straight. And at the heart of it all, in the midst of the sleek aircraft and the hum of machinery, stood Martin Walker. The old man had become a fixture in the hangar. He didn't just fix planes, he helped wherever he was needed. Whether it was offering advice to a young technician or just sharing a quiet story from his past, Martin was always there, a constant reminder of what it meant to be truly great. Ben had started spending more time with him, listening to his stories, picking up on the subtle wisdom that seemed to flow from Martin with every word. Martin never pushed it on anyone. He didn't need to. He simply shared his knowledge, and if you were paying attention, you learned. It was one of the quietest forms of leadership Ben had ever seen. You know, Martin said one afternoon, his voice steady as always, when I was flying these planes, we didn't have all these fancy systems. It was just me, the controls, and the wind. You had to trust your gut, trust your instincts, because sometimes the technology didn't give you the answers. Ben looked up from the plane he was inspecting, his hands still on the controls, but his mind focused on Martin's words. You had to listen to the aircraft, feel what it was doing. And even when the tech said everything was fine, you had to know when something wasn't right. Martin paused, his eyes distant, as if he were looking back through time. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always end well. But you learned from every mistake. Ben nodded slowly, the weight of the words settling in. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about understanding them, about building a relationship with them that went beyond the manuals and diagnostics. As the weeks passed, Ben found himself applying Martin's lessons in ways he never thought possible. It wasn't just about the planes anymore. It was about the people, too. The young airmen who had once laughed at the old man were now the first ones to seek out his advice. It wasn't something they were told to do. It was something they wanted to do. Martin had earned their respect, and not by force, but by simply being who he was. One afternoon, Colonel Hayes called Ben into his office. "Ben," Hayes began, "I've been hearing good things about your work lately. Your attitude, your focus, it's been impressive. You've come a long way." Ben smiled, but the praise felt different. It wasn't about him. It was about the lessons he had learned, the ones that Martin had taught him. "Thank you, sir," Ben replied, his voice humble. "I've had a good teacher." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "A good teacher, huh? You mean Martin Walker?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, he's taught me more than any manual ever could." Hayes smiled slightly, a rare expression for him. "I'm glad to hear it. I've noticed the change in you, Ben. And I've noticed the change in everyone around you." Ben thought about that for a moment. It's not just me. Everyone's learning from him. The following week, the hangar was busier than usual. The base was preparing for a major operation, and the tension was palpable. Airmen moved quickly, efficiently, with the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. As the operations team gathered for the briefing, Ben found himself standing next to Martin, who was watching the scene unfold with his usual quiet intensity. "You ever think about going back?" Ben asked quietly, his voice low enough not to interrupt the meeting. Martin turned to him, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Back," he repeated. "Back to flying?" Ben nodded, but Martin shook his head. "Those days are behind me, son. But I'm still here, and that's what matters. I'm here to help. That's all I can do now." Ben looked at him, feeling a new sense of understanding. Martin had given so much of himself, and now, in his later years, he was still giving. Not just his knowledge, but his presence, his quiet strength. "You've already helped more than you know," Ben said quietly, his voice full of respect. Martin smiled, his eyes twinkling. "You're learning, Ben. You're learning." And as the day progressed, Ben realized that Martin wasn't just a legend. He was a living reminder that greatness wasn't about the past. It was about what you could still offer. Martin might not have been flying planes anymore, but he was still making a difference, one lesson at a time. And Ben knew, without a doubt, that he would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his life. The morning of the operation arrived, and the hangar buzzed with activity. Planes were being prepped, airmen were double-checking their gear, and there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. The mission ahead was critical, and everyone knew it. But as Ben Carter walked through the hangar, he noticed something different. The usual chaos of military life was still there, but there was a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It was as if the entire base had learned something they hadn't realized they needed to know. As he passed the rows of aircraft, Ben spotted Martin Walker, as steady and calm as always, watching the scene unfold. Martin had become something of a fixture in the hangar, a quiet presence that commanded respect without ever raising his voice. Ben couldn't help but wonder, as he often did, what it was that made Martin so special. He had fixed planes, shared his stories, and offered wisdom that Ben now realized was invaluable. But there was something more, a depth of character that came from years of service, from the understanding that the most important lessons weren't just about machines, but about the people around you. Ben approached Martin, who was standing by a table, carefully inspecting a set of tools. "You ready for today?" Ben asked, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. Martin turned to him, a slight smile on his face. "I'm always ready," he replied. "But you all are the ones who'll be in the thick of it. Just remember what we talked about." Ben nodded. "I won't forget. It's about knowing when to trust the machine, but also when to trust yourself." Martin's eyes glinted with something Ben couldn't quite place. "Exactly," he said. "The machines will only take you so far. It's the people who make the difference. And you're ready for that." The words resonated with Ben, but there was still something nagging at him. He had learned so much from Martin, but he still hadn't figured out how to carry it all with him into the field. How do you apply the quiet strength of a veteran like Martin in a fast-paced, high-pressure environment? "What if we fail?" Ben asked, his voice soft. "What if I don't live up to what you've taught me?" Martin regarded him quietly for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he spoke. "Failure isn't about falling short. It's about not getting back up. The best we can do is show up, do our best, and learn from it. Every mission is a chance to grow." Ben absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. He had always been driven by a need to succeed, to prove himself. But now, with Martin's words echoing in his mind, he realized that true success wasn't always about the outcome. It was about the effort, the integrity, and the willingness to learn. As the briefing began and the airmen gathered around, Ben stood tall, his heart beating a little faster, but his mind clear. The mission ahead would be tough, but he knew now that he was ready. Not just because of the training or the equipment, but because of the people who had come before him, like Martin Walker, who had shown him that strength didn't always have to be loud. It didn't have to be flashy. Sometimes, the strongest people were the quietest, the ones who didn't need to prove anything. Ben took his place alongside the others, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The operation would be difficult, and there were no guarantees. But as he looked around at the team, the respect he now felt for them, for Martin, and for the mission itself, filled him with a confidence he hadn't had before. He was no longer just a young airman looking to prove himself. He was a part of something bigger. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The morning of the operation arrived, and Ben Carter stood at the edge of the hangar, watching as the airmen filed in. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Gone was the usual hustle and bustle of soldiers rushing about, their actions driven by the tension of a high-stakes mission. Today, everything seemed different. It wasn't just the weight of the operation ahead. It was the way the airmen moved, the way they interacted with each other, and the calm confidence they exuded. It was as if Martin Walker's quiet lessons had become part of them. Ben's eyes moved across the hangar, and there, standing off to the side, was Martin. The old man was leaning against the wall, his eyes scanning the activity in front of him. Despite the urgency of the day, Martin appeared unmoved, as steady as ever. It was as though he had seen it all before, and for him, the chaos of military life was just another day at work. Ben took a deep breath and made his way over. "You ready for today?" Ben asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Martin turned toward him, his expression unchanged. "I've been ready for a long time," he replied with a small smile. "But it's not about being ready. It's about how you handle what comes your way." Ben nodded. "I've been thinking about that. The whole trust yourself thing you said." Martin raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what have you figured out?" Ben hesitated for a moment, his thoughts racing. "I think I finally get it. It's not just about the mission or the tech. It's about the people. About knowing that no matter what happens, we have each other's backs." Martin nodded, his gaze softening. "That's the most important part. The mission may change, the technology may evolve, but the people, Ben, the people are what make the difference. Always." As the briefing began and the airmen gathered around, Ben stood a little taller. He felt different today, more confident, more aware of the responsibility he carried, not just for the mission, but for his team. He glanced at Martin once more. The old man stood off to the side, observing, not a part of the briefing, but still very much a part of the operation. It was as if Martin was a silent pillar, holding everything together without ever needing to be the loudest voice in the room. The operation was tense. As the team prepared to head out, Ben found himself walking alongside Martin, the hum of the engines in the background blending with the quiet chatter of the team. The base was alive with activity, and the weight of the mission settled in Ben's chest. But this time, he didn't feel the usual pressure. This time, he felt prepared. "You've taught me a lot," Ben said quietly, his voice low enough not to interrupt the others around them. Martin turned to him, his eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "I've taught you what you already knew," he replied. "It was always inside you, Ben. You just had to recognize it." Ben's thoughts drifted back to the countless lessons Martin had shared with him, each one subtle, but powerful. They weren't lessons about technology or tactics. They were lessons about life, about trust, about resilience. "I think I'm ready," Ben said, the weight of his words settling in. Martin gave him a small nod. "I know you are." The team began to board the transport planes, and Ben followed, his heart steady, his mind clear. The mission ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ben knew he was ready. Not because of the equipment, not because of the tech, but because of the lessons he had learned from a quiet old man who had seen it all before. As the planes taxied down the runway, Ben looked out the window, his gaze steady. The operation wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about carrying the lessons of the past into the future. And with that, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. The mission was underway. Ben Carter stood at the edge of the runway, watching the planes take off one by one, their engines roaring as they soared into the sky. The weight of the operation was heavy, but today, something felt different. He was ready. The airmen moved with a quiet focus, their steps synchronized, their expressions determined. It wasn't just the adrenaline that kept them sharp. It was the sense of purpose that had settled over them, the same quiet confidence that Martin Walker had shown them all. Ben had learned a lot in the past few weeks, but today, it wasn't just about what he had learned. It was about what he was becoming. As the team boarded their transport planes, Ben found himself sitting next to Martin. The veteran, as usual, was calm and composed, his eyes scanning the activity outside the plane, but his presence was a comfort to Ben. It wasn't just the wisdom Martin had shared with him. It was the understanding that, in this moment, they were all part of something bigger than themselves. "You okay?" Ben asked, his voice quiet, though he already knew the answer. Martin looked at him, his expression unreadable, but the flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'm always okay," Martin replied, his voice steady, almost amused. Ben couldn't help but laugh. It was a simple answer, but it carried a weight of truth. Martin wasn't worried. He wasn't looking for validation. He was simply ready. The plane rumbled beneath them as they flew higher, and Ben's mind began to drift back to the lessons Martin had taught him. It wasn't about the technology or the mission details. It was about the mindset, the ability to adapt and trust yourself in the face of uncertainty. It was the understanding that no matter what happened, you could always find a way forward. As the transport plane made its way toward the drop zone, Ben felt his nerves settle. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had the tools to handle it. Not just the tools he had been given, but the ones he had learned to develop: patience, calm under pressure, and trust in his team. The plane shook slightly as it descended, and Ben could feel the weight of the moment press down on him. The jump was coming, the real test, and yet, in the back of his mind, he found himself thinking about Martin's quiet confidence. He wasn't afraid of the unknown because he had faced so much of it in his life. And now, as the door to the plane opened and the wind howled in, Ben understood that fear wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being able to face what was ahead and still move forward. As the airmen readied themselves for the jump, Ben caught Martin's eye across the cabin. The veteran gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. Ben nodded back, and in that moment, everything felt clear. The mission, the operation, it was all part of something bigger, but it was the people that mattered most. The team, the bonds they had forged, the lessons they had learned. And with that, Ben felt ready. He stepped toward the door, the cold air rushing past him, his heart steady in his chest. This was it, the moment he had prepared for, the moment Martin had prepared him for. The jump was smooth, a perfect descent into the unknown. As the wind whipped through the air, Ben Carter felt an odd sense of calm. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but something deeper, something he had never felt before. The sheer certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The team landed with precision, spreading out in the field with practiced ease. Ben's heart raced, but his movements were controlled, every step guided by the lessons he had learned from Martin Walker. The mission was far from over, but Ben felt different now. His training had prepared him for this moment, but it was the wisdom from the old man that had truly made the difference. Move fast, stay low. The team leader barked as they moved forward, their bodies cloaked in the shadow of the tall grass. Ben kept his head down, staying in rhythm with the others, but his mind kept drifting back to Martin's quiet words. Trust the team, trust yourself, trust the mission. Those words had been drilled into his mind, but today, they took on a new meaning. They weren't just about surviving the mission. They were about understanding why they were doing it in the first place. The objective was clear, but the stakes had never felt higher. The weight of the mission pressed against Ben's chest, but it didn't crush him. Instead, it gave him clarity. He knew that no matter what, he would face it with the same calm and quiet confidence that Martin had shown him. As they neared their target, the sounds of their steps faded into the background. Every movement, every breath, was measured. Ben's eyes scanned the horizon, every muscle in his body alert, his mind sharp. They were getting close now. The objective wasn't far, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite place. A sense of responsibility, perhaps. They weren't just soldiers on a mission. They were the ones who would make the difference. Stay sharp, the team leader whispered as they approached the compound. Ben nodded, his mind already focused on the next step. It wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost. As they breached the compound, Ben's heart beat in perfect time with the team. The air was thick with tension, but he felt as if time had slowed. Every action was calculated, every movement intentional. It wasn't until they reached the final checkpoint that Ben realized how far he had come. The young airman who had once doubted himself, who had questioned his worth, was now leading with the same quiet strength that Martin had shown him. They secured the area quickly, efficiently, and once the operation was complete, Ben stood at the center of the compound, looking out over the team. His chest swelled with pride, but not from the victory. It was from the realization that the true strength of the mission wasn't in the machines, or the tech, or even the training. It was in the people, each one playing their part, trusting in each other, and in themselves. And as he walked back toward the extraction point, Ben felt the weight of responsibility once again. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose, one that he had earned and one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The extraction was smooth, and the team moved swiftly through the quiet fields. The dust from the landing aircraft still hung in the air as Ben Carter, along with his fellow airmen, made their way back to the transport. The mission was a success, but there was no celebration, no fanfare. They knew this was just another day in the life of soldiers, another job done, another task completed. But for Ben, something had shifted. As he climbed aboard the transport, his mind wasn't on the mission anymore. It was on the lessons that had brought him here. The lessons from Martin Walker, the quiet veteran who had shown him what true strength really looked like. It wasn't the flashy displays of bravery or the loud, confident speeches that marked a great soldier. It was the calm, the patience, and the wisdom that came from years of experience. As the transport ascended, Ben glanced out of the window at the sprawling landscape below. The mission was over, but the lessons were still with him. The weight of the operation had felt heavy at first, but now it felt like something he could carry without fear. He had learned how to trust his instincts, how to trust his team, and most importantly, how to trust himself. The rest of the team remained quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts, but Ben felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced before. This wasn't just about completing the mission. It was about the understanding that he was part of something bigger, something that wasn't defined by a single operation or a single victory. It was about the people, the bonds, and the unspoken strength that came from knowing that no matter what happened, they would stand together. As the plane made its way back to base, Ben sat back in his seat, his mind replaying the mission, the lessons learned, and the people who had made all of it possible. He thought of Martin, the man who had taught him more than any textbook or drill instructor ever could. It wasn't just about knowing how to fix a plane, how to perform under pressure, or how to follow orders. It was about something deeper, something that came from years of experience, from living through challenges, and from knowing that the most important thing wasn't always the mission itself, but the people you shared it with. Ben knew he had grown as a soldier, but more importantly, he had grown as a person. He understood now that the real strength came from within, from the quiet confidence that came from knowing that no matter how hard things got, he could face them head on. And as the plane touched down, Ben Carter stepped off the transport with a newfound sense of purpose. The world outside may have been full of chaos, but for him, it no longer felt like something to fear. It was just another challenge to face, another opportunity to learn, and he was ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, Ben Carter began to adjust to life back at base, but the lessons from the mission, the ones that had shaped him into a better airman, still lingered. The tension of the operation had faded, but the sense of purpose remained, and it wasn't just in the work or the routine. It was in the way Ben saw the world now, through the lens of experience, of calm confidence. He had learned something vital, not from a manual, but from a man who had seen it all before, a man whose quiet strength had changed the way Ben viewed everything around him. Martin Walker had left a mark on him that was more than just advice or words. It was a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of something greater. As Ben stood in the hangar one afternoon, watching the airmen prepare the planes, he realized how much he had grown. The tasks at hand no longer seemed daunting. The work still required precision, still demanded focus, But now Ben understood that it wasn't just about the mechanics. It was about the people you worked with, the trust you had in one another, and the quiet moments when you understood that you were more than just soldiers or airmen. You were a team. The team. Ben smiled to himself as he recalled the day he had first joined, eager, nervous, and determined to prove himself. Back then, it had all been about the mission, about succeeding, about achieving something on his own. But now, after everything he had experienced, after the lessons Martin had shared with him, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people beside him. The people who had his back, just as he had theirs. "You look like you've got something on your mind," came a voice from behind him. Ben turned and saw Colonel Hayes approaching, his steady eyes fixed on him. "Just thinking about the mission, sir," Ben replied, his voice calm. "And about everything we've learned." Hayes nodded, the hint of a smile on his lips. "You're growing, Ben. I see it. And so does everyone else." Ben felt a swell of pride in his chest, but it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had learned, that he had adapted, and that he was now part of something bigger than just the mission. "Thanks, sir," Ben said quietly, his eyes drifting back to the planes, the hum of the engines filling the background. "I think I understand now. It's not just about being ready for the mission. It's about being ready for whatever comes next. And that means trusting the team." Hayes placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, a rare gesture of acknowledgement from the normally reserved officer. "Exactly," he said. "The mission may change, but the team will always be the foundation. As long as you remember that, you'll always be ready." Ben stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of Hayes's words. The team was everything. He had learned that in the field, but now, with the clarity of hindsight, he understood it in a way that was deeper, more meaningful. As the days went by, Ben continued his work, his confidence growing with each task he completed. But what mattered most was the quiet strength that had become a part of him, the same strength that Martin Walker had shown him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't brash. It was steady, unshakable, and always ready. The work never stopped. The challenges never ceased, but Ben was no longer overwhelmed by them. He was ready, not because of the machines or the training, but because of the people, because of the lessons he had learned and the team he was now proud to be a part of. Weeks passed, and life on base settled back into its familiar rhythm, but Ben Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The hangar, the planes, and even the daily tasks seemed different now. He had become more aware, more present, and that sense of purpose he had gained after the mission had stayed with him. The respect he had earned from his fellow airmen felt different too. There was no longer any need to prove himself. The work he did spoke for itself, and the quiet strength Martin Walker had shown him became the foundation for everything Ben did moving forward. One afternoon, Ben was called into Colonel Hayes' office. The usual hum of the base felt distant as Ben walked down the hallway, his mind running through the possibilities. Was it about the mission? About something else he had done? When he stepped into the office, Hayes looked up from his desk, his expression calm but focused. "Ben, have a seat," Hayes said, motioning to the chair across from him. Ben sat, trying to keep his nerves in check. Hayes folded his hands on the desk, his eyes locking onto Ben's. "I've been getting reports from the higher-ups. They've noticed the change in you, the improvement, the way you've been handling the work, the team. They want you to step up. You're ready for a leadership role." Ben blinked, momentarily stunned. Leadership? Him? The idea felt foreign, even though he had grown so much in the past few months. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm ready for that," Ben said, his voice unsure. Hayes smiled slightly. "You're more ready than you think. You've been learning, watching, and applying everything you've picked up, from the basics to the bigger picture. It's about more than just knowing how to fly or fix a plane. It's about understanding the team, supporting each other, and leading when the time comes. And that time has come for you." Ben's mind raced. He had been focused on his own growth, on learning how to do the job well. But this was different. This was a responsibility he hadn't considered. "I'm honored, sir," Ben said, feeling the weight of Hayes' words. "But I've still got a lot to learn." Hayes nodded. "And you will. We all are. But you've shown what you're capable of. The team trusts you. Now, it's time for you to lead them. You don't need to have all the answers, but you do need to lead with confidence, with humility, and with respect. That's what matters." Ben sat in silence for a moment, processing what Hayes had said. The weight of the responsibility began to sink in, But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt something else, determined. He was ready, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew he had the support of his team, and he could rely on the lessons Martin had taught him. "Thank you, sir," Ben said, his voice steady now. "I won't let you down." Hayes nodded. "I know you won't. You've already proven that you won't." As Ben left the office, he felt a sense of pride, but also a new understanding. Leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about being there for the people who relied on you. And as he walked back to the hangar, he realized that he wasn't just ready to lead the team. He was ready to be the kind of leader who inspired, who listened, and who always remembered what it meant to be a part of something bigger than himself. Months passed since the operation, and Ben Carter had settled into his new role as a leader on base. The responsibility weighed on him at times, but the lessons he had learned from Martin Walker and his team had prepared him in ways he hadn't fully realized at first. His leadership style had shifted from being reactive to proactive, and he found himself more aware of the people around him, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and knowing when to lead with authority and when to step back and let them shine. One afternoon, as Ben walked through the hangar, he spotted Martin again, sitting quietly at the far corner, just like he had done many times before. Martin wasn't involved in the hectic work of the day, but he was always there, observing, offering a quiet word of wisdom when needed. Ben approached him, his thoughts drifting back to their earlier conversations. "How are you doing today?" Ben asked, offering a smile. Martin looked up from the small task he had been doing, his eyes sharp as ever. "I'm doing fine, Ben," he replied, his voice calm. "Just keeping busy." Ben sat down across from him, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. "I've been thinking about all the lessons you taught me," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The team, the mission, how it all connects. I've learned a lot, but sometimes I still wonder if I'm doing enough." Martin nodded slowly, understanding in his gaze. "You're doing fine. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about doing your best every day and guiding those around you in the right direction. You've learned that. You don't need to have all the answers, Ben. Sometimes, it's about asking the right questions and trusting those you lead to find their own answers." Ben thought about that for a moment. He had been so focused on the idea of being a perfect leader, on never making mistakes. But Martin's words had a weight to them that made Ben realize that perfection wasn't the goal. It was the trust, the respect, and the ability to guide with integrity that mattered. "I still have a lot to learn," Ben admitted, his voice quiet. "But I'm starting to see that's okay." Martin's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ben noticed a sense of pride in the older man's gaze. "That's the first step, Ben. Understanding that you don't have all the answers, but you're willing to learn and adapt. That's what makes a leader. You've got what it takes." Ben smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had the support of his team, the wisdom of Martin, and the trust that came with the role. As the day went on, Ben moved through the hangar with a renewed sense of purpose. The work was still demanding, the challenges still present, but now he approached everything with a quiet confidence, knowing that leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about doing the right thing when it counted, being there for his team, and always striving to be better, not for himself, but for those who counted on him. And as he watched the team work, Ben knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever: quiet strength, humility, and the understanding that leadership was a continuous journey, not a destination.